Without further ado, Carl Gross, the speaker of the topic, prioritizing remediation of accessibility issues. Carl Gross.
Thanks, Mike. I'm actually going to mute my speakers so I don't cause feedback. So if there's any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. And this is the saga of my terrible microphone issues. I actually went out today and ran out to get the best possible microphone that I could. And the guy at Best Buy was like, yeah, you should totally get these gamer headphone microphone things. These are great. And it turns out they don't work on computers. I still have it running as Bluetooth. Hopefully it sounds good. And I'd like to just dive right in right now with, this is actually one of my favorite topics. So really quickly about me, Mike's already introduced me. My email there, though, is kgroves@Paciolo Group. You can follow me on Twitter at Carl Groves, and my phone number is there as well. That's actually a picture of me, by the way. And many of you may not know, I used to be a rock star. I used to sing for a band in the 90s called the Spin Doctors. I'm actually kidding, but that is me. And that was in my younger, trimmer, less hairy days. So first off, I want to start off by setting the stage here. Now I want to talk about what is an accessibility issue. We need to move away from this idea that that accessibility issues are something separate from any other issues that are out there. Accessibility issues are not nice to haves. They're not enhancements. You know, when we log these things in our issue tracking system, it's not an enhancement. It's not like a new story. It's a bug. We've created a flaw in our system which harms the ability for the system to be used effectively by users. Okay, so it would be as if a feature in the system didn't work. And so it's really important for us to get that idea of an enhancement or a nice to have out of the way. If it's a problem, if it's an accessibility issue, it's a bug, we need to address it as such in our standard issue tracking methodologies. Now, why do we need to prioritize accessibility issues? Well, just like any other issue, it's because we didn't get it right in the first time. Okay, and so now, just like any other bug, we need to allocate the resources to do so. Now, this picture that I have on here actually shows why this is important. Ideally, we want to avoid the bug in the first place, right? Because now we have actual money and actual resources that need to be dedicated to fixing these things. And I have a little formula on here that allows us to calculate the cost per defect of fixing issues. Really simply, it's the number of people times the number of hours necessary to fix it times the number of divided by the number of defects, and that number is multiplied by the cost per person per hour. And this is really important to keep in mind, that as we are fixing issues, we are spending money. It's whether it's actual money or it's money paid out in terms of salary and the fully loaded cost for that specific human resource. When they're fixing bugs, they're doing something completely differently than the level of effort necessary in actually creating new features and making improvements to the system. So we need to apply these resources as effectively as we possibly can. Now, as Mike mentioned in the introduction, I've been doing accessibility consulting and web development and usability consulting for over a decade now. I've performed scores of audits and expert reviews to look at the usability and accessibility of web-based systems. And often I can count on one hand the number of systems that I tested that were in pre-production phase. They were prior to that they weren't deployed when I got there to do the usability study or when we got there to do the audit. So many times the testing is going to be performed on the systems that were already released to users. And in this scenario, an organization's level of risk is at its highest. People are actually using the system at that point, and therefore the organization and its developers are going to require sufficiently informative data from their accessibility testing that's detailed, clear, and most importantly, actionable. Okay, it doesn't really do us any good to throw them a report that's filled with a bunch of accessibility violations unless that report also includes information to help them actually fix their problems. They need to know what their problems are, where their problems are, and how to fix them. So there's also an additional item that they need to know when to fix them. So as we do our accessibility audits, and we at the Pasiello Group, we turn them over to the client, they're almost universally ask us the same question: what do we fix now, right? So this is going to help us apply our resources most effectively. Post-deployment bug fixes are needlessly expensive. If we can get ahead of them, we should, but obviously, as I said, we get into this testing phase after the fact, and now we need to apply our resources in a manner that's going to reach the deepest towards the greater good. So prioritizing remediation is going to help minimize the accessibility's impact on the business, right? So for those of you who've ever worked for a large organization, trying to fight for budget is a big deal that a lot of people face, and so then now we have these bugs. We're gonna sort of throw them over the fence, and now accessibility is going to be an impact on the business. Hey, can you shut that dog up, please? I clicked the unmute button and it clicks itself. So that was just that was the smoke break section of the presentation. So so we need to understand what risk is. Risk is the potential that a chosen action or activity, including the choice of inaction, is going to lead to a loss, and a loss could be any sort of undesirable outcome for the organization. And so ultimately, remediation is going to be a risk mitigation strategy. Now, I really don't like the idea of selling accessibility by fear. And so what I don't want to do is characterize risk as like we're going to get sued. That's obviously a real risk. That risk is based on a number of factors that I'm going to discuss a little bit later. But basically, there are many types of risks that are created by bugs in a system. The first risk, of course, is poor quality. What I mean here is a problem in the operability or performance of the system for the end user. Okay, this could possibly lead to lost income. The volume or severity of the bugs is such that users who want to buy our products or consume our content do not or cannot do so, and then we lose money. That's a real risk too. We also have ancillary losses. This would be losses caused by spending money when you don't need to. And what I mean here is primarily these accessibility issues that have to be fixed after the fact. Oops, we decided accessibility is important, and now we got to spend money we didn't need to spend, and that negatively impacts the money we have available to do other things, to add new features, or to, who knows, even market some of the new features on our website. Lots of people talk about your online application couldn't be easier for car insurance, and then next thing you know, you have to go through and fix it, and that's gonna hinder other possible new features of the system that we're creating, and that's a big deal. Like I said, human effort actually costs money. Those humans doing anything other than developing new work is money that's in my opinion lost. And then finally, yes, this also the risk exists for certain organizations that we could have an administrative complaint or litigation. So in terms of administrative complaint, what I'm really talking about here in the United States is a formal complaint against Section 5 of the Rehabilitation Act or ADA, depending on the type of entity you are. These are real, actual, set-in-stone legal requirements, and the non-compliance with those legal requirements is going to raise the chance that we're going to have a heavy hand of regulators breathing down our necks. Even the threat of these sorts of things can be a risk, because at that point, basically, what ends up happening is an organization will flood a project or flood the development team with a diversion of work into repairing accessibility stuff rather than doing other things. It can be extremely disruptive in terms of the workflow, and so the threat of litigation there is very possible depending on where you are in your industry. I've done a lot of research on this myself. I have on my blog, I have a list of accessibility lawsuits and settlements, and I haven't updated it in a while, but last I checked, I think it was 41, 44. Those two numbers stick out. And if you are basically the largest in your industry, and you exist in finance and insurance, online retail, travel, education, government services, stuff like that, your risk is really high. Almost all of those 41, 45, whatever lawsuits have happened in those things. So it's a big deal. And Elle Waters, a former coworker of mine, said it best, I think, when she was talking to someone, and they were talking about risk, and Elle's statement was really insightful. She said, would you rather spend your money on your timeline or on someone else's timeline? And that's a big deal, because what will happen in these situations when you deal with a complaint like that is now your ability to steer your own budget, steer your own project timeline, goes from being in your hands to being in someone else's hands, and that's definitely a problem nobody really wants to have. So hopefully this will go towards answering Jonathan's questions. So when we're talking about risk, we also have to take into consideration this idea of probability. And my picture here on this slide is a good one for myself as an ex-smoker and family members who smoke and got lung disease, because your probability is the number of negative events divided by population. And what we mean here is, in this case, what is your probability of an actualized risk? So in its simplest form, probability equals the number of negative events divided by population. So your probability of anything happening is based on the size of your population and the number of negative events within that population. But we're not talking about the direct population of all people or all websites. So in other words, if 10 people out of every 100 get a speeding ticket every 5 years, then your probability of getting a speeding ticket every 5 years is 10%. 10 divided by 100 is 0.10, so it's 10%. So in terms of accessibility lawsuits or other negative events, it's important to understand how to determine your population. Your population isn't all the other sites on the web. So For instance, in the case of this woman smoking on the slide, my risk or my wife's risk of getting lung cancer is not the same, because of the fact that we don't smoke anymore. So our population is our peer companies. Now, how you define your peer companies involves a number of factors, such as your industry, site features, the number of dogs in your house, and hold on. And so, the audience demographics, the reach, and the engagement and risky behavior. So when I say peer, I'm not really saying competition, because your competition could be a brick and mortar entity, or it could be a company that's much smaller. And so while they compete in the marketplace, they're not a peer. Again, to use a simple analogy, lung cancer probability equals the number of cancer cases divided by the number of people engaging in cancer-causing behaviors. All right. So although everyone has some level of probability for lung cancer, people who are engaging in the cancer-causing behaviors in a very different peer group. So in the case of Jonathan's question, I would say that prior lawsuits in higher education have been oriented towards really big higher education institutions, Penn State, and I think another one was the CSU system, not just a single CSU campus, but the entire system. So we're talking about really big. The ADA is very concerned, or not the ADA specifically, the DOJ is very interested in higher education these days, especially in the case of online learning, because online learning offers a really an unprecedented level of access to learning for people with disabilities that didn't really exist before. So it's gonna tend to be a bigger deal, I think, in the future. I wonder what Mike has to say about that before I move on to our risk amount. Right. So let's Mike's comment here is that MOOCs make the entire EDU market an open target, and that's really, I think that's going to be a growing area of accessibility lawsuits in the future. All right, so now let's talk about our risk amount. So a risk amount basically is the, I'm sorry guys. The joys of working from home with construction across the street. Okay, so from the probability, we can determine how much we're risking. Okay, our risk amount is our probability multiplied by our expected loss. So our risk amount equals the probability of a negative event times our expected loss in the case of a negative event. So, for example, if we have a 10% probability, our risk amount is 10% of the total expected loss. So it's going to be 0.10 times total expected loss. So to use an extreme case, we'll use the Target lawsuit. So in the Target lawsuit, Target settled with the NFB for $6 million plus $40 million in attorney's fees, and I think they pledged a certain amount each year for some sort of annual thing for contributions to a nonprofit. Anyway, we'll just call it $10 million to keep a round number. So based on their population, which is in this case very large e-commerce sites, they had an 8% probability. So 0.08 times 10 million equals $800,000. So if you're a company that's a peer of Target, your level of risk is $800,000. Some people are going to argue that you're actually risking $10 million because that's what Target settled for, but that doesn't take into consideration the probability of the lawsuit. So from this, I think we can derive an accessibility ROI. So your return on investment for accessibility work, assuming you fit into that 8% probability, is $800,000 minus the money you spend on fixing or remediating these accessibility-related bugs. So for those of you who may be interested in trying to sell accessibility internally, it may make sense to take this into consideration when trying to gather budget for the efforts. Is how much do we stand to lose if we don't do it? How much do we plan on spending? And as long as you save more than your expected loss, bada bing, you have ROI. Now, Mike actually talked about this in his first, in his presentation, which was the first of the ID24, where he was talking about loss of sales as the ROI, as the risk amount. So it doesn't have to be a lawsuit. In Mike's case, he was talking about a loss of sales for people who had calculated their expected amount of purchase per user, their anticipated amount of income per user who makes a purchase. And Mike had said, you know, this is the number of people who you may be losing, and so that was their risk amount, was a loss of sales. So it doesn't have to be a lawsuit. And as a matter of fact, I think we can make this argument without trying to scare people with the specter of the heavy hand of justice. So now let's talk about our challenges in trying to fix the system. I love this picture. I try to squeeze it into every slide deck I make, which is it's a road construction project, or at least it looks like one, where you can't turn left, you can't turn right, you can't go forward, you can't go backwards, and there's traffic cams in front of the way. The one road on the left is says road closed and wrong way, do not enter. So it really looks like you can't go anywhere from here. So let's talk about trying to change that a little bit. A couple of things to keep in mind, and that is the first one I think is not all accessibility problems are equal. And this is sort of a problem that we have when we turn over that big report that we give to our clients. Is our reports often tend to have what I call a lot of plop factor. The plop factor is a term that I actually got from a prior boss, and that is the sound that the report makes when it hits the table. The amount of plop, the sound that it makes, the plop sound it makes when it hits the desk. That's the plop factor of the report. So here we have this big report. We ship over to the client, and they go, "Oh man, this is going to be a lot of work." And that's not, well, yes, there probably is a lot of work to be done because we're really good at finding problems, but not all of them are equal. They're not equal for a number of reasons. There are going to be differences in terms of time that it takes to do the work, the impact on the end users, the impact on the business. These are all really important considerations. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of guidance in terms of how to fix those things. And so if you're relatively new to accessibility, maybe you've tossed your pages through a couple of free online checkers, or maybe even purchased an online tool for accessibility, you got this huge report and you've got to figure out what to deal with. And a lot of people look towards the WCAG level and the WCAG success criteria as their guidance for determining priority. Some of that actually stems from people believing that WCAG 2.0's level is synonymous with WCAG 1.0's priority. What happened in 1.0 was that that the word priority didn't really take into consideration any other factors other than user impact. So they said that, you know, priority one things were really important, you had to do them, and so on and so forth. Those things were entirely gauged based on the impact of the user, and that's valuable. But unfortunately, for a business to allocate resources, they need to know a little bit more than that. And I think that the WCAG working group in creating WCAG level did a good thing by creating level, which is very the terminology is different, which is more than symbolic. But it also you can see in the archives of some of the discussions there, and even some of the early working drafts. You can see that they talked a little bit about these factors that I have listed here, and unfortunately, none of that stuff made it into the final published recommendation. So I think they've sort of left us high and dry in any sort of discussion about what level is. But keeping in mind that level really is not appropriate, in my opinion, for discussing that. So I want to give you my own idea here for what these things can be. So WCAG level A are going to be things that are very important, have a really high impact on the user, and are typically very easy to implement without impacting the business logic or the presentation logic of the system. So WCAG level A is where you see stuff like alt text for images, right? So it's super easy to just add alt text for image. It's not going to impact the presentation of anything, and you're good to go. And it's got a huge impact for the user. Same thing goes for stuff like form labels. That's a level A thing. Level AA are things that are also as important, but may have an impact on the presentation logic or the business logic. And this is why, unfortunately, color contrast is listed as a AA thing. It's AA because of the fact that it may actually impact the site itself. That if we've come up with branded colors, you know, for all of our marketing material, and now we have to go ahead and redesign our site to meet color contrast stuff, that might mean that it's going to alter our branding a little bit. People are not very pleased by that idea. And then AAA things are things that are often going to be technically or logistically infeasible. Things like real-time captioning for live video, or things like real-time audio description. Currently, there's no open source player available that even does audio description in the first place, much less offers the ability for someone to stream audio description into them. So again, that's a big deal. So what I did was I decided to take my own list of best practices and sort them by impact. And I gave an impact of 1 for each user population affected. And I carved that out into low vision, blind, hearing impaired, mobility impaired, and cognitive. In other words, violating a best practice that impacts all of them got a 5 for impact. Violating a best practice that only impact one population, like blind people, got a 1. And what I found was that based solely on user impact, 33% of those were AAA, and the ones that got 4, there were 30 of those that were A's, 10 that were AAA's, and 10 that were AA's, and 15 that were AAA's. So 4 user impacted populations existed that were in 27% of those were AAA. So clearly, user impact isn't the only thing that we should be considered. Obviously, not all best practices are going to be created equally. You know, providing a help link on each page, which is mapped to WCAG 3.3.5, is definitely not the same as provide the ability to pause, stop, or hide content that updates automatically, which is 2.2.2, or provide the ability for users to turn on sound only at their request, which is 1.4.2. The latter case here illustrates the need to rank the impact of individual populations. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So the impact of auto-starting audio for blind people is huge, right? I mean, when you have auto-starting audio, that's gonna hinder the user's ability to do anything effectively on that page, right? But the impact on a mobility impaired person and a low vision person is going to be much higher than someone who's hearing impaired or cognitively impaired. So these are the kind of things that need to be taken into consideration. So let's talk really quickly at time, right? So time is often at a premium. Doing bug remediation takes time, and this is ideally time that we do not want to spend because we should be getting everything right in the first place. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So creating bugs is going to cause us to incur technical debt. So for those who don't know what technical debt is, it's a metaphor referring to the eventual consequences of poor design. We always have to pay our technical debt in some form. That's going to be either the time to repair those bugs, or we may have to repay that technical debt other ways, like supporting users in different fashions, telling people to call our help desk. That's not that's not really a good mitigation because you're still incurring technical debt, right? So repair of bugs is a time expense, and time is money. So we need to ensure that we prioritize on the important things so that effort is not used frivolously, that we don't spend a lot of time with relatively low level of impact. The next thing we need to take into consideration is the impact on other things, time, on our budget, on our resources, and our system. So bug repair is always going to cause an impact on the budgets, resources into the system. Do these bugs cause us to require outside help from a consultant? Do we need to outsource this repair to a third party? Do we need to take that work away from a third party because they've proven themselves unqualified, right? And we see that a lot, actually. I was on a big project where work had to be shifted away from a team, an outsourced development team that was not capable of creating an accessible UI. That skill set didn't exist. And how is fixing this bug going to impact the actual system? Is it going to impact our presentation logic? Is it going to impact our business logic? This is especially true for systems that are not using MVC, that systems that have their business logic and presentation logic intrinsically tied together. Are there other features in the system or in upcoming builds that are going to be impacted by fixing this? These are all really important factors to consider. So let's talk about a couple of remediation approaches. The first one I'm going to talk about is simple remediation, right? By the way, I love this picture. This is a picture from a par 3 golf course that I go to, and this is, for those who can't see it, this is their version of an accessible ramp. The stairs here, I mean, I swear this must be, I don't know, 45 degrees. If you took a wheelchair down it, it'd probably be really, really fun, and you're never going to get it up there. So I chose this one for our simple remediation because really, this is going to be a simple idea. We're going to focus solely on time and simple impact. How long is this going to take, and how bad is this problem? Right. That's how we're going to measure this approach, and from that, we're going to figure out what's going to get first. So the pros here, it's focused on the user, right? It's super simple to understand how big of a deal it is, and and uh, so on. It's super simple to understand, and often the hunch from an expert is often as good as something more formal. Unfortunately, it doesn't take into consideration things like impact on the business or impact on the system. Again, you can say, oh man, that's going to be a huge deal, but there's no actual sort of formal methodology behind it. So some ideas I've come up with on advanced prioritization. I'm going to have 6 things to put into consideration. As before, we're going to consider user impact and ease and speed of repair. But when we talk about we're going to talk about some other things, impact on the system. So how's this going to change the interface? Will it cause any impact to our business logic? Another thing to consider is volume. How often does this specific issue exist in the system? Where is it? Where is the problem? You know, let's face it. Nobody actually goes to about me pages or about us pages or whatever. So if that's where the issue exists, that's going to be a lower priority than something on the home page, right? So we know from our analytics, our home page gets the highest amount of traffic, so on and so forth. And then, hey, let's talk about secondary benefit, right? So can we get any additional business boost by fixing this? And in all 6 cases, I'm going to rank these based on 4 scores. Each item is going to be ranked none, low, medium, or high. None, that's a 0. In other words, either it's not a consideration or there's no weight given by this consideration. Low, in other words, the weight for this factor is low compared to the other things. Medium, and then high. In other words, there's a lot of weight in this case. And each of these factors gets considered along the way. Another thing I did is I want to measure the impact on users broken down by the user type. So remember, you know, things like name, state, role, and value are going to impact people that impact more than just one user population. It's going to impact those user populations differently, though, right? So here, what I did was impact itself is basically the simple sum of the impact on different user populations: blind, visually impaired, hard of hearing, motor, cognitive, and speech. And each of those are going to have each of those are going to have the same 0 to 3 consideration given to them. I chose 0 to 3, by the way. I've seen other people talk about 1 to 10 on something like that, and I think the problem there is one of math, because when I tried to do this with 1 to 10, the problem was that it wasn't apparent when you actually ran it in the real world which ones should get the highest prioritization. So when I reduced this to 0 to 3, that's when I saw actual statistical significance on some test runs that I ran. All right, so ease and speed of repair. How long is it going to take? How difficult is it to fix? So my picture here is of a of a steel pole in front of an accessible ramp, and obviously this is super easy to figure out, right? How long is it going to take and how difficult is it? Just take those 4 bolts out and we're good to go, right? And then, whoops, impact on the interface. So how will this alter our presentation logic or our business logic, right? There's going to be times when an accessibility-related repair may be necessary, which would have a negative impact on the user interface or the operation of the interface as it's designed. So one area I see this a lot is color contrast of the primary site templates. And in these cases, poor color contrast is going to be used, which is related to our branding. And improving the color contrast is essentially going to require a redesign of the site and possibly even the branding. So, wow. So in this scenario, things that require significant redesign need to be given a lower precedence over things that will have little to no impact on the interface. The next one is volume of repeat issues. The first thing to consider here is how many times does this exact issue occur? This is especially important in things like automated testing, right? Because if let's say we run a scan with some tool and it finds this same issue, 10,000 times using the same exact code, we know that that's going to have a very quick repair, and it's going to have a huge impact because it's probably in the template, right? An example I used to use often was in the case of like the CNN homepage on the search field. Let's say that search field there didn't have a form label. That's going to be a big deal. It's going to exist everywhere on the CNN page. Let's fix that baby once. We're going to get a huge benefit from that, right? People are going to be more effective at searching. But also, how many times do similar issues occur, right? So do we have problems on all of our form fields or all of our forms where form fields are missing labels? I'm doing an audit right now of a system where their text inputs have great labels. All their text inputs, their text areas, their select elements, all those are great. It so happens that whatever framework they use or from whatever classes they have somehow isn't effectively creating labels on radio buttons and checkboxes. So we need to get them to fix that. And we're going to give that a high priority because they're very similar issues. It's not the exact one, but they're similar enough. Next one is going to be the location of the issues. Quite simply, where is it, right? So if this is in a location that is that has high traffic, and or the location is critical, right? So if it's it's in a critical workflow, something like registering for something or logging in. Those are critical workflows, right? They're a dependency in that use case. Those are going to have a high priority. We need to make sure that that people can succeed on that. It's probably even tied to some conversion factor, right? And so that's going to be a big deal. And then finally, we should consider secondary benefit. I don't mind considering some secondary benefits when I'm thinking this stuff. The obvious ones here are, is this going to make things a positive experience for users who are older or who have low literacy, maybe even people on low bandwidth. We know that people in rural areas of the United States don't have things like FiOS or broadband, stuff like that. There's also reduced development and maintenance time, so on and so forth. But also, what about SEO benefits, right? So if there are some SEO benefits to be had, and you can quantify that, that's a big deal, right? Well, I remember one time I worked with a client who said every converted customer is worth about $15,000. Every conversion is $15,000 conversion over the life of the account. That's a big deal. So if we can improve SEO like that, that's real money that we're talking about. So after that, let's do it. Let's weigh all these things. So our final formula here is a little bit on the cramp side. It's impact plus repair speed plus location plus secondary benefits times volume is going to equal our priority. We're going to sort by that, and then we're going to fix them accordingly. Pretty cool, huh? But there's a little bit more than that. The first time I gave this, this presentation, I focused simply on that formula there that I talked about, and some other people said, "Well, wait a minute, shouldn't we weigh these a little bit?" And I actually think it was a good buddy, Olivier in France, who had mentioned that they were talking about some of that stuff in some methodology they were doing, and they actually published an academic paper on this, which was ironic because it was about the same time I gave this series of blog posts and the presentation. So I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting. Some of these things probably should be weighed more, right? So I shouldn't give as much weight to something like my secondary benefit as I would to the impact on the user, right? So what I did was I grabbed a bunch of peers out there in the Twitter sphere, had them do a Delphi method, a Delphi approach. And the Delphi method, if I understand correctly, was actually first used to determine how many nuclear weapons it would take to blow up the enemy. So it was a DARPA thing, and they would go through and you ask people anonymously, what do you think the answer to this question is? So I asked a bunch of people anonymously what I thought their weighting factor would be, and on each of these factors, and then I collated the results. I did a second round. I said, this is what we have so far. Do you agree or disagree? Would you like to change your answer? So on and so forth. And this is what we came up with. The user impact here is listed as 3.95, meaning that in this formula here, the actual formula would be much more like 3.95 times whatever our determined user impact would be. Impact on the interface would be 1.5 times, so on and so forth. So these things bang, these get our weights. What has ended up happening actually is I've placed this algorithm in the priority ranking of Tenon, and judging by the results that I've gotten from doing some automated testing of Tenon to see its capabilities, this has actually turned out to be a really valuable feature. So from this prioritization, now that we had this ranked, right? So now that we've weighed all the things and we have our issues ranked, now we need to manage our remediation, right? So we have our issues, now we need to manage it. I love this picture. This is I had to put this here. For those who can't see it, it's a fireman. He looks like he's talking to the media, and a little caption under his name says, his name is Lieutenant Les McBurney. As soon as I saw this, I had to put this in slides. Anyway, this guy's going to help us manage our remediation. So how do we do this? We have a report full of bugs, and now we got to do something. So this is where I'm going to take another analogy from from another field, and that field is chemistry. So in chemistry, dilution is the process of reducing the concentration of a solute in a solution, usually simply by mixing with more solvent. So in our case, the solute is bugs, and the solvent is the code itself. So what we want to do is we want to add more solvent, and our solvent here is clean code. And so our concentration is going to be our number of bugs divided by the lines of code. This is really important for sort of understanding the level of inaccessibility, say, of a specific document, say, is how many issues, how bad are the issues in this code. That's going to give us an idea of a couple of things. One of those is going to be improvement. So here, to continue my chemistry analogy, we see here 3 beakers that indicate different states of concentration, right? So given the 3 examples, we see our start point, our midpoint, and our endpoint represented by beakers of solution. And in our starting point, we see a beaker that has a high concentration of problems, especially high impact problems. So our high priority, medium priority, and low priority are indicated here by dots. And the high priority issues are solid red. The medium priority have a hash mark through them, and low priority are going to be the clear circles, basically. In our midpoint, we see that the vast majority of high priority problems have been eliminated, and this leads us to address our medium priority problems. And finally, in our endpoint, we see almost all of our problems are low priority. We can choose to fix them if we'd like, and I believe that we should. And finally, by being on the second TPG, or to use a unicorn, this is our fully compliant system, right? We've gone through, we've iterated through these issues to the point where we've now got a fully compliant system, as if there is such a thing, but anyway, I like to think positively. So we can actually use all of this to measure our improvement. right? So we can use this, we can measure this by tracking it over time. Very simply, we measure our starting concentration minus our ending concentration, in other words, our improvement, and that's going to be divided by time. Now, there's an inherent flaw in this simple approach in that it's most accurate when that time interval is a short one. And this idea of a 2-point representation for a first derivative such as this is going to be only first order accurate, so it's really only useful for specific snapshots. But another thing to keep in mind too is that the number of lines of code is going to change when the bugs are fixed, so you can't just continually count the bugs each time. You also have to count the lines of the lines of code when we do our concentrations. So in conclusion, prioritization is going to help us to get better, more efficiently, more effectively. It's going to save us money, it's going to save us time, and ultimately it's going to let us make bigger improvements for the user quicker. And so that's going to reduce our risk. And we have multiple factors that we can use to determine this priority, and we're going to iterate on these efforts to progressively dilute them. We don't have to come full bore and fix everything all at once. We can actually do this iteratively so that we can also incorporate this into existing processes, and then we can measure our success. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. So Daniel's question was, how much time does this process take in practice? Yeah, one of the things that I didn't mention, mostly because I didn't want to get stuck in the mud of trying to discuss this specific part. A lot of this, I think, is basically is going to have to be determined ahead of time, right? It's going to be some of this stuff, some of this information based on the user impact and all that sort of stuff. You don't want to calculate that every time. So this is why I tend to like a best practice based approach to doing testing, even if it's with an automated tool or if it's in your manual test processes. I like the idea of doing some of this calculation stuff ahead of time. Otherwise, it's going to be a problem to try to do that. Let's see here. Daniel also says, at which point in the, let me scroll down. You guys don't mind if I maximize the chat, do you? So I can see. At which point in the testing processes are the weightings computed? So that sort of goes back into my my previous comment about the best practices part, and that is the determining some of that ahead of time is great, because then you can go back through the issues themselves and do some of the stuff that's not predeterminable, like the volume of the issues and also possibly the location. Jonathan says, not sure if the IB and IV and I, so on and so forth, covered this, but you mentioned a chart that prioritize accessibility bugs. I actually did that on a Excel worksheet. It's ugly. So unfortunately, I don't really feel comfortable sharing it because it's not very user friendly. I just did it for myself and basically tossed it. Anne said, can you repeat how you got the concentration start and concentration end? So the concentration, remember, the number of bugs divided by the lines of code. So the concentration start is the number of bugs divided by the lines of code when you do the first round, and then the concentration end is post remediation. So it would be like a regression audit would get you that concentration at the end. Jonathan says, is there anything like WCAG that you feel does a better job at prioritizing accessibility bugs? Not really. I think the thing about WCAG, especially the normative information about WCAG that's beneficial, is that it is technology agnostic, and so the success criteria themselves can be carved out into multiple best practices. I would possibly look into things like the UWEM, the Unified Web Evaluation Methodology. I don't know how mature that is. I know they were working on updating it as a result of WCAG 2. Don't know if they have. I've been out of touch with that. And also the AccessiWeb standards in France may have some of that information, but I'm not really positive on that. So Daniel says, we're looking for a methodology to apply to an application framework, not just applications. Are there parameters you would add when scoring defects in an application framework? Yeah, I would. So that's what's great about this is you can add up other things like the those secondary benefit things, right? Because there are other business concerns, right? So whatever concerns that may impact changes to that framework might be beneficial to consider as well. Now, Justin says, wouldn't any accessibility bug chart you created be different for each? For example, the chart for testing YouTube might be different than testing Gmail. So, as I mentioned earlier, that there are certain things that are always going to be the same. Excuse me, the same. Those would be those best practice related items themselves. So, let's make up a best practice on the fly. Our best practice would be make sure that all images have alt attributes, right? So that's going to have some of those things, I guess, to use some sort of language like the HTML spec would consider that stuff intrinsic, right? Some of these things like the user impact, ease and speed and repair, some of those things I discuss are sort of intrinsic to that specific best practice, right? So accessibility attribute, all attributes for images is going to have really high impact for users who are blind or users who use assistive technology like a screen reader or something like that. Not at all going to be a high user impact for users with cognitive disabilities, unless, of course, they're, I take that back because they may use screen readers too, but maybe not motor impaired, right? So sighted users who are motor impaired may not be that impacted by alt attributes for an image if it's a decorative image. And the ease and speed of repair are super fast. So these are intrinsic to the specific best practice. So the only parts that aren't intrinsic is the specific location of the issue, and the volume of repeat issues. So those would be calculated when you log the bug, say. You could give those scores. As a matter of fact, I did run an experiment with some of this stuff using Atlassian Bonfire. Atlassian Bonfire is a companion application that's they've renamed it now, but anyway, it was a companion application for Jira, and you can customize a lot of this stuff. You can add extra fields and stuff like that, and so we would have specific fields that were always populated with best practice information, and then we would add some of these other factors along the way. It was pretty interesting. I was a little unhappy with Bonfire's inability to save all of that project setup stuff across projects, but it was an interesting idea. Anyone else? So David's question was, what are your thoughts on crossover success criteria that helps lots of people? In this case, what I've found is that it's most beneficial to have these things be very granular in nature, because of the fact that there are, so for instance, if we look at WCAG 1.1.1, I've personally carved that out into somewhere on the order of 36 best practices. And those 36 best practices are extremely granular in nature because it helps me to calculate some of these things, some of these user impact things at that very granular level, in a way that's I don't think is going to be terribly helpful if the best practice is overly broad. All right, well, that's it, unless there's any other questions. I personally want to thank everybody who's come along the way. I'm going to turn it over to Mike Paciello, who can say a few final words. But thank you all so much for having the wherewithal to stick with us for so long, and for tweeting and helping the GAD hashtag and the ID24 hashtag do so well on Twitter, and for sharing information. So thank you all, and I'm going to turn it over to Mike now.